Thanks, David. Firstly, I'd like to thank Joe and the committee for inviting me here to Glenties. I'm actually from this part of the world, from about 40 minutes in the road. But it's a great honour and pleasure actually to be participating in this. I was here yesterday, and I know I went talking to Don Thornhill at the end of it, and he used the word disturbing. Because out of yesterday's session, I remember going home in the car and saying, geez, I wonder about that speech tomorrow, because it went away from thinking, you know, the state finances are in a mess, we have the banking sector in crisis, we have the whole indigenous business sector in crisis, and even the church came in for mention, and even the GAA after the Louth match. So we're just saying the whole country seems to be in crisis mode. And I think Don used the word disturbing, and it was an interesting word actually out of it. And I know the theme for today's session was lessons and future prospects. And I suppose I started saying I need to put my head more into future prospects, because if you come from this part of the world, you tend to think much more of you need to survive, I need to look at the future, and there's not a lot you can do sometimes about the past and just keep moving on. So I think there is a line in the sand where we're at the moment. And I think there's only so much energy and focus and resources that have to keep devoted to the past. I think we definitely, and I think coming out of what I've heard here in Glenties, we definitely need to start putting a lot more energy and intelligence into creating the future. And I think if anything out of, I hope this week, that it's more around how do we create that future, and to a large extent maybe draw a line in the sand. And I think it's within our own wherewithal to actually create that future. Because I did a lot of research in terms of, David mentioned Postbank, which definitely I think was a very interesting transformational opportunity for the country. By background, I'm not a banker by nature. I have a different background. I was an accountant and with KPMG for years, and did a lot of work internationally in Russia from the 1980s. I sat on boards in Germany and the UK, and also very much in the aviation sector. And what I've seen, having gone in then to set up a bank and start a bank in the Irish market, at the time where the whole crisis was starting, Postbank was set up in 2007. It was interesting to watch the dynamic from within the sector over the last number of years. And I suppose overall what I'd frame is probably a lot of myths actually around banking as an industry and as a sector, which don't seem to apply in other sectors, where the myths and the barriers have been broken down perhaps 10, 20 years ago, and they still exist within that sector. And I suppose when I'm looking at saying, how do you really look at what are future prospects? And to me, it's really about fairly well what I call transformational change. I see a huge amount of similarities with what's going on in the banking sector with what happened in the airline sector back in the 1990s, back in the 80s and 90s. Back at that stage, and I think there's been real transformational change in that sector over the last 20 years. Back then, there was a very strong view by national local governments that you needed a national airline that was locally owned, had to be driven by the country. It was very high cost. It was driven by local policy, tight international policy, and there was huge challenges for consumers in terms of actually its availability, in terms of service, affordability, access to the service. And it really was a challenge even in terms of business itself. And then there was major transformational change where you had the low-cost business model came into play, the low-cost airlines, and they fundamentally challenged the status quo. And they really threw that model, and it took them, Ryanair was set up in the 1980s in Ireland originally, and actually nearly went bust actually in the early 90s. Several times it actually drained a huge amounts of capital and nearly went bust. And through different initiatives it was kept going, and then eventually it actually found its position. But to a large extent, when you're looking at new players coming into sectors, the wagons do circle. And it's very difficult to actually break down large traditional sectors and to change the thinking that goes on around them. And my own sense is the same issues existed at that time around ownership, competition, the whole cost structure, service levels. And to me, there's a debate that needs to happen in the banking sector, not just about the current crisis, but in the wider sense of transformation of that sector, no different to, I think, the airline sector. And I think it does take 10 or 15 years to see that coming through. So just to put some frame around the lessons learned and future prospects. From yesterday, and it's clear I think to everyone, there's 4 really fundamental issues that we have to grapple with in the country. Jobs are obviously crucial, with 13% unemployment, and we're now starting the immigration of talent again. I was talking to somebody just before the session, and he was saying he's also looking, at his children, one finished college, one coming out of school, and the same, their plans are to go to Australia or to emigrate. I have 2 boys myself who will probably move into the same thing. And it's I suppose this part of the country, you see that quite a bit. We need to develop a very sustainable Indigenous enterprise base. The whole Ireland itself, its budget and investment needs huge structuring around debt, taxes and cost cutting. And we heard yesterday major challenges on that. And there's no doubt we need a robust financial system that supports that export-led growth and developing the smart economy. On the lessons learned, there's been, I think I have files when I started looking at it on my laptop of reviews, analysis, reports, commentary by lots of experts in relation to what happened, why did it happen. There's lots of regulators, extremely intelligent people, much more than I would be, looking at all of those reviews, what did actually happen. And I suppose I boiled it down eventually, in history we keep repeating mistakes. And looking at it on crisis, we've had several crises, we've had recessions going back to the 1600s, the tulip mania, South Sea bubble, the Japanese crisis, Latin America, East Asian crisis, the dot-com bubble. So I think if there's one lesson is we do actually keep repeating mistakes. So spending too much time analysing them, I think is where the energy is needs to be diverted, I think, more into creating the new future. I think the main, to me, lessons out of it is banking and financial services is a global sector. It's highly interconnected and it's very international. It's not a local market. And I think that's one of the myths we do. We think it exists, we can exist and corral it within the country. It is an international business. It's global, it's very interconnected, and if the current crisis proves anything, it's that. Human beings as well, we have herd behaviour. We'll always follow the herd. We're all afraid to miss out on the good times. And as a result, business follows similar models. They all use similar models. If one is doing better, pressure comes on from investors for everyone to follow. And you can see that herd instinct in lots of things. You see it in how the banks themselves operated over the last 10 years. You see it in the property mania, the whole credit mania, and how consumers themselves behave. And I suppose to me they would be the 2 main things out of the lessons learned for me. We will always have herd behaviour, and banking and financial services is very much a cross-border activity. It is not just local. And in that context then, how do you look at the future of Irish banking? And what should the future of Irish banking look like? I went last night on the website for the Department of Finance because what I was struggling with over the last number of days was, is there a vision and strategy for banking or financial services in this country? Because if we're to look at future prospects, it's not just solving a crisis, there has to be some vision or strategy for the long term. And I think if anything came through to me yesterday was people out there on the ground are crying out for somebody to start demonstrating a vision and a strategy. Because just solving a crisis and survival does not give people any hope. And I think that's missing. And listening to the Taoiseach last night on the news, where he was commenting around negative commentary. And it's like everything, news always fills a vacuum. And if you have no strategy or vision, then the only commentary there is the negative commentary, which is around a crisis. And I think to a large extent what the country is crying out for is really to give vision and strategy. So in terms of creating that, my thoughts around it were looking at the current situation first. Where are we now? There were issues with the Irish banking system before this crisis, and I think we shouldn't forget that. In the Irish banking system, you had a Competition Authority report going back 6 or 7 years ago, and a lot of those issues are not addressed. Barriers to entry, issues around competition, issues around access to services, major issues around the payment system in this country. It's costing business about $2 billion a year extra because of the amount of cash and cheques and the way payments are operated in the country. We are well behind even countries in Eastern Europe like Latvia, Lithuania in terms of how we operate payments. and principally because we have not evolved the system and we kept it very controlled by the two main banks over the last 50 years. Our clearing system is highly controlled by two main banks. As a result of that, most of the international banks who have come in to set up services in Ireland have actually went and set up their own clearing system. That doesn't happen in other countries around Europe if you look at banking. Clearing systems, payment systems, credit bureaus should be using the best technologies. It should be innovation, research and development, and it should be open to anyone to do business on. And while you have restrictions and protectionist positions in relation to that, then it adds cost and adds more money. We had light touch regulation, and if anything, the banks have been extremely effective in lobbying and keeping themselves outside what I call normal structures. To give an example, it surprised me. I'm an accountant by background and was an auditor in my previous life. And I found it very surprising when the issue of directors' loans came up on Anglo-Irish Bank. I said, but everyone had to spot that. Even the most junior auditor would see that, because it's a company law requirement from the 1990s that you disclose directors' loans in companies' accounts. Even the smallest company has to disclose directors' loans. And any junior auditor has to go and look at movements and what we call window dressing. People always look for window dressing, where it's closed out before the end of the year and drawn down on the first day in January. And I couldn't fathom how that could have been missed in an institution that's publicly quoted like Anglo. And then my finance guy, I said it to him, and he said to me, but Margaret, that doesn't apply to banks. They actually had an exclusion under company law where they didn't need to disclose directors' loans like all other companies. And if you look at it, there's significant derogations right across the system in lots of areas where the financial sector are actually get the exceptions and the derogations. They've been extremely good at lobbying and keeping themselves outside the normal system that we've actually put in place to apply to a lot of other corporate structures and businesses. And also the Irish banks would have been the highest profit margins of most retail banks worldwide. That's why this market is so attractive over the last number of years for new entrants. They had very high profit margins, which means cost structures were high, and as consumers we were paying a lot. So to me, there was lots of challenges there before the current crisis that we shouldn't forget about, and we still need to address with this. And against that, I think where we have been very successful is we applied great vision in actually setting up a thriving international financial services centre in Dublin. It's only 30 years old, not quite 30 years old. And what was interesting was it was set up as a separate model, totally separate to the normal Irish banking system, both in terms of structure, systems, governance. And it's interesting to watch it over the last 2 years. It is definitely more resilient and has been more resilient than the normal banking system in the country. And yet it's only 30 years old. And it's interesting to see it as well, I see, because we're winding down and we have a good number of people who lose their jobs. But what's good is quite a number of our people are actually getting jobs with international banks who are actually expanding in Ireland. You have the likes of Aviva setting up a hub for their whole European operation for compliance and risk out of Dublin. Citibank are expanding in areas, Bank of New York Mellon. So those banks are already gone through a crisis, supported by parent companies, and are already creating jobs and expanding. And we're 2 years into it in the local market. So what I see in the current situation, I think we need to move out of it quickly, is what I call, and I've said it a number of times over the last year, and having come from an airport background, you learn all the signs. It's post-traumatic stress. You see lots of emotion in the system. The system's highly defensive. And I'm not just talking about the banks, I'm talking about the whole sector, government, banks, civil service, anyone related to it. There's lots of emotion, it's highly defensive, and it's totally in crisis management mode. And in any normal business, it is important to separate crisis management from what I call trying to create a new future. And we seem to think that doing post-traumatic stress management, we can create a new future, and I think that's a major risk. The system is heavily government supported. It's a bit like we're on steroids at the moment. Between capital injection, Bank of Ireland will be owned 30% by the government. I think through the AIB, there's some estimates there could be up to 70%. Anglo-Irish is fully government owned. You also have, David mentioned that the net cost to the taxpayer is likely to be 25 billion, assuming Bank of Ireland and the AIB will eventually repay everything in full. We have a huge dependency on the ECB for funding because the wholesale markets are not operating as effectively as would be needed. We've NAMA taking out the bad assets for a long-term workout over probably 10 years. I would say it's probably more like 20 years. And it's far too early to be assessing results of that at this stage. We have to look at stronger regulation. But above all, I think the biggest issue we've got is there's a massive loss of trust and confidence of the public and business in the banking sector. We've damaged fundamentally the building society model in the country. And I think there's serious questions over how much damage we've done to the credit union model. So to me, there's a need to go what I call back to basics and to really look at some serious restructuring of the business models. And I think also in the context of where the economy is going, the cost structures are too high. So in terms of taking that as the as-is position, we had issues there already. We're now looking at what I call in crisis management and survival mode. How do you create a future vision? And as I said, I went on the Department of Finance website last night and I was actually looking to see, out of all of this, is there a vision or a strategy being created around banking? And I have to say I came away extremely shocked, disappointed, because there is none. Basically, in summary terms, saying the immediate action is to maintain stability of the financial system, and in the medium to long term, we develop policies to support financial stability, high standards, protect consumers and help develop financial services in the state. And to me, there is no real strategies underneath that as to how those will be done. The words sound good, but to me there's no real strategy. And also I think what's more interesting, and I think a bigger issue, is the vision. There is no vision for the banking system, which we now see is so fundamental to the public and to business survival. It is not integrated into the government strategy for the smart economy or for innovation. And we've seen a lot published over the last 12 months or so. We see the whole education system being reviewed to drive towards a smart economy that's very innovative. We see the IDA setting its strategy for that, Enterprise Ireland. We saw announcements last week on research and development. But yet, I don't see how we're setting a financial system for this country that equally supports a smart economy. And I don't see any strategy for that coming through in any of the, and there's a myriad of documents and research being done. So to me, looking at how do you create a vision or a strategy that's fit for the country, and probably taking some of the learnings as an outsider coming into banks for in the last couple of years. I think there's a lot of myths being created in the sector. One of the myths is that only bankers can run banks. I would use the analogy, you have sectors who are equally as important and challenging as banks, which is pharmaceuticals, utilities like gas and electricity. And yes, we don't have a position where in pharmaceutical companies they say the only people who can run them are physicists or chemists. It needs good management, needs good business management, and equally needs to bring in the skills. The same with technology, which is an extremely complex business as well, but they don't say it can only be IT people who run technology companies. And to me, there's a myth created around banking that it just has to be pure bankers, and I think that's one of the risks that's come out to me out of what's happened. And we need to integrate it. So to me, we also need to, I think, establish some of the key principles and need to be re-established. And I think the first one that we're in danger of losing is money is actually not free. Governments have to pay for it, business has to pay for it, and individuals. And because of the whole state support in this crisis mode we're in, we're creating expectations that money is free. And we're doing political decision-making and interference around that concept. And that's a very dangerous position to get into. Deleveraging is the order of the day. That means reducing credit everywhere, and that's happening not just in Ireland. I read an international bank review, the Baltic countries, Norway, Finland, Denmark, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal. All banks have to deleverage. They have to reduce the amount. They've been heavily dependent on international. The banks equally are borrowers, not just individuals and businesses. The banks themselves borrow to run their business, and they over-borrowed. They did what was the old language for accountants. When I was trained in the 1980s, they were over-trading, very heavily over-trading. We know that language for other businesses, but the banks equally are in the same place. And the old line that cash is king is crucial, and they ran out of liquidity. So in any case where businesses overtrade and they become illiquid, then you end up with the crisis mode. So they have no choice but to deleverage. And once the banks are deleveraging, individuals have to deleverage and businesses have to deleverage, because we have lived on a credit bubble for a number of years. And that is extremely painful, that you have to pay back that credit and the credit is going to come out of the system. And I don't think there's any other way around it. We can make all sorts of credit review groups. We can set up as much committees as we want. But at the end of the day, credit, everyone has to deleverage. The other thing I'd say is that capital in the world now is very scarce. There's been a serious erosion of wealth, a lot of capital lost, and capital is very scarce. And capital will look to wherever it can go to get the best return. And it's interesting, I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago, an international investment party, very big international party. They're actually doing the restructuring of Lehman's in the States and in Europe. And they were saying that there's still not an acceptance in Ireland that money is not free and that capital is actually now very scarce, and that we still assume that we can get a premium for businesses in this country. So there's a serious amount of realigning of expectations needed within the Irish market. To me, the Irish banks do require fundamental restructuring to make them profitable again and independent of the state. And I think the big question to me that needs to be determined in coming up with that restructuring is Irish banking an essential service? And that's a word I learned mainly in my airport days, is it an essential service? Were airports essential services? Hospitals are essential services. Schools are essential services. And there was always a debate in the airline sector, are airlines essential services? If a service is essential, then it needs to be government owned and government funded, and has a totally different wherewithal than a normal commercial service. And to me, that's a big question. We hear a lot of language at the moment around systemically important. I have to say, I'm struggling with understanding the word systemically important. It's a bit like we use buzzwords and we think they sound good, but does systemically important mean it's an essential service? I don't believe, and I think that's where the whole question's coming over, you know, what banks should survive, what shouldn't, and what's the future like. To me, we're confusing what really is an essential service with what needs to be supported during a crisis and then weaned off it to become a commercial operation again. I think there's huge confusion in this country, and that's where I use the emotion comes into play around ownership. We seem to have a sense emotionally that we own the Irish banks. The reality is, before the crisis, the majority of the ownership of even AIB and Bank of Ireland was actually foreign shareholders. The same way Ryanair is principally owned by foreign shareholders. Most big companies in this country, the investors are foreign shareholders. And we have a huge confusion between ownership and business strategy. And to me, they're two separate things. And I see that coming in through at play at the moment. There's, I think, also we need to question and deal with this issue around what I call retail banking, commercial banking, asset management, wealth management. What I've seen evolve in the country over the last number of years is retail banking started off as good retail banking, and basically they started moving into commercial banking under the strained structures and systems, and then eventually they decided to become wealth managers. If you look at any models outside Ireland, and it's interesting, I've seen in the last month or so from the financial regulator, the focus here, separation was about, is it an Irish bank or a foreign bank? Even listening to all the dialogue and play. What's good to see now is that in the European banking market and internationally, you see retail banking is structured, systems, processes, structures and how they're run are fundamentally different to commercial banking. They need different skill sets, different levels of expertise and different organisation structures if you're to manage and control them effectively. Here we muddled the whole lot up together, and we've damaged fundamentally as a result, I think, the retail banking model in the country. And it's interesting, the regulator in the last month, the new regulator, has now changed its own organisation structure. Up to that, they were structured, they dealt with Irish banks and they dealt with foreign banks separately. Now they're saying we deal with the retail banking sector, we deal with the commercial banking sector, and we look at fund and asset management separately. So we're moved into what's the business, how are we doing it? I think it's interesting to look at the insurance sector in Ireland. There we don't seem to have the same emotion around it. We're quite happy that our insurance companies or ownership can be by international companies. And interestingly, we haven't had to do the same bailouts by governments in recent years or in the current climate as we had with the banks. And yet they're supporting the economy, supporting business and supporting consumers. The international banks in Ireland, I think looking at them over the last number of years, They're retrenching because they got hit so badly on some of the property with some bad decisions as well. However, if you look at them, there's been no taxpayer bailout. They've had to be supported by their international parents for capital. They've invested in them, put in the capital. Their technology development is definitely going ahead of the curve. They've adapted change much quicker in the crisis, and they're already putting in new structures and processes. And I think it's interesting to watch that dynamic. I think they're retrenching because they see all the challenges in this economy, but in terms of how they respond, I think they move much quicker. So I think there's major scope for services development here. I think we've blocked progress in that sector for years. I see now a circling of the wagons going on. Reduced competition, service provision is going to be damaged, and I think much higher costs. So I think we need a much clearer understanding of the banking model we need to support the economic development plan for that smart, innovative economy. What I've said is a new model is required, and I'm proposing it probably has to have two strands to it. One is what I call the Irish international banks and the non-Irish banks, which are international banks cross-border. I think ownership needs to be looked at. I think we're too small a country to assume that we're going to be able to be 100% Irish owned, and we don't have that anyway, even with Bank of Ireland and the EIB. There will be international investors in those banks. They're going to be scale and large by nature. The range of services will be across the whole gambit, commercial, retail, and they will be required to operate to international standards for government, for funding, for technology. They should be heavily involved in research and development, and I find it interesting the Irish banks you never see in that space around research and development. I think their international operations on payment systems, clearing, credit transactions has to be all cross-border, so they have to be ahead of the curve. And they need to be extremely competitive internationally, and they need to be moving into the space. I saw recently Facebook is actually setting up a virtual bank because people are now doing e-commerce, buying on the net. So Facebook sees an opportunity with the collapse in the banking system to get involved in banking, virtual banking. You see Virgin Airlines in the UK bought a very small bank. It didn't even have 50 million of assets in the UK last year, and it's setting up a whole new consumer banking arm. To me, that's one side where we have what I call large international banks operating either from here, with here, that actually supports what I call international business for Ireland. And if we're an export-led country, then we need that support. And ownership, I think, is a different issue that we really need to think about. And if it's not an essential service, in that sense, like hospitals and schools, then I think we have to really address ownership from a policy position. Secondly, the second strand, I would say, I think we absolutely have a major gap in the Irish market for a proper domestic financial services business. I don't think we have a policy on it. I don't think we have a strategy on it. The questions I raised, should that domestic financial, and that's to support what I call the domestic economy, which we need to get back moving as well for economic development, should that be regional? I think there's an absolute gap in the market for an enterprise bank. I see it in Europe, where they have enterprise banks supporting small local businesses, and they use EC supports. I met last year when Postbank we were looking at developing loans, and one of our focuses was consumers and small business, and we were exploring the opportunities around that and how you manage the risk with small business, and particularly newer businesses, startups. And I met somebody, he's a Mayo man actually, who's in Luxembourg, and he's involved with the European Investment Bank and an offshoot of that on the insurance side. And interestingly, the EC has provided supports for years for small business and supporting small business with financing for the last 15 years. And he told me that for the last 10 years, the only country in the EC that has not accessed those funds has been Ireland. He said Denmark is accessing it, Germany is accessing it, France is accessing it. And the issue around small business is always about risk. But there is also an insurance fund underneath the funding and the banking side of it where they will actually share risk, which means the banks can actually give out loans, take a higher level of risk, because the EC, basically through its support structure, will support it. And the same is happening with regional airlines, the same is happening for the regional development through the EC. So to me, there's a need for an enterprise bank. I think there's a need for community banking. I think we have the credit unions and building society models, which are really savings and loans, are quite damaged, I think, out of the current crisis. But I think if Postbank, if I saw anything with the Postbank model, an initiative was an absolute appetite in this country for proper consumer banking that's based on consumers and that provides a good service. As David said, we're in a wind-down operation, and with people we're getting people to close down their accounts. We're getting letters in from most people requesting closure of their accounts, but most of the letters are the huge loss to the country and the huge loss to the service. And we're finding we have to encourage people to try and move to other banks because they don't want to actually move. State savings, I think, we need to work out how that fits in the domestic financial services. I think it needs to be a level playing field and very transparent. I think that whole domestic financial services, it's regional, enterprise, community, state savings, we have to look, I think it needs a different governance, funding and support model to what I call international banking. It should be very low risk, and I think then there's opportunities for other providers in that space around consumer finance, the card providers. You see now where you see advertised, I know at Gala, I think supermarket in Ardra yesterday when I stopped for petrol, I noticed they were advertising a 3B card. Instead of getting a credit card, you can actually just top up a card and put money in and use it as a credit card. So you pre-fund your credit. There's huge opportunities and huge developments happening in Turkey, Eastern Europe, right around the world on all of that which suits consumers, and we have no access to it in the Irish market. I think mobile banking, which is extremely well evolved in Africa, huge opportunities. We're the biggest users of mobile phones in the whole of Europe. And yes, we have not made any touch of going near mobile banking, and yet there's massive opportunities, a way to provide low-cost services. So I think there's a real opportunity here to differentiate a low-cost service model that really meets small business and consumers, which is a very different model to the large-scale banks you need to be cross-border and working internationally. So to me, I suppose how I'd finish is, don't waste a good crisis. I think we should look for transformational change. I think there's only so much review or analysis we can do of the past. I think what we should really be doing is analysing how do we create a transformational model, a bit like the airline sector did, which differentiates and really provides access to everyone to banking services on a very cost-effective basis that fits a small open economy that needs to be export-driven. Thank you very much.